Video series by talking about the Han Dynasty. This is the golden age of classical China. Even though the Qin Dynasty is important because it sets precedents, it is the Han Dynasty that really sees these things through. The economy is thriving, the population is increasing. And also there are significant connections between classical China during this period and the rest of the classical world. China and Rome actually had a close relationship despite the very long distance between them. So as I was saying before, it's important for us to realize that even though the Qin Dynasty was short, it actually set a lot of precedents for things that are going to be further developed during the Han Dynasty. So in a lot of ways, the centralization of power that Shi Huangdi started in the Qin Dynasty is something that's just going to be further developed under the Han. But one thing that's much better is that the Han rulers were not seen as so harsh compared to Shi Huangdi, so people prospered, people tended to be happier with the empire, less revolt, less unrest, and most likely the reason why the empire lasted so long. As I was saying as well, it's important for us to realize that the Han Dynasty oftentimes is compared to the Roman Empire during this period. They both experienced a period of peace and prosperity. They traded frequently with one another, and they have very, very similar achievements in terms of infrastructure, in terms of political leadership, and they actually also both rise and fall around the same time. Also, the Han Dynasty is important because it grew in size geographically. As we see in the image, the map of the Han Dynasty here, we see that it actually pushes much farther west, which is one of the reasons why there's such a very strong trade connection between the Han Dynasty and places farther west like India and even as far as Rome. Okay. So, the most significant Han ruler was Han Wudi. He came to power, or he ruled from 141 to 87 BCE, and his accomplishments are things that actually persist well into the modern era in China. Arguably the most significant development, political development, that was made under Wudi's leadership was the civil service exam. So essentially what the civil service exam was this test that all people had to take if they wanted to have a job in the political bureaucracy. Now this test actually contained many elements based in Confucian teachings, and apparently it took years, if not quite a bit of one's lifetime, to study for and pass this test. The test was so rigorous that there were universities that were established in the Han Dynasty that were specifically designed to prepare people for this test. And what this does is it creates what we call a meritocracy. Now, meritocracy is quite what it sounds like. The idea is that you get your position based on merit, or you earn your position, rather than getting your position because you know somebody or because you're related to somebody. Think about when you apply to college, for example. If you have legacy at a college, meaning that your family members went there, that's good and everything, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you are a worthy candidate. No offense if you have legacy at a school. But if you have good grades and good test scores, then that means that you deserve to go to that school based on merit. So that's what that means. Also, under Wudi's leadership, China begins what we call the Pax Sinica. This is Latin for the peace in China, and this actually happens at the same time as the Pax Romana, or the peace in Rome. So it's important to realize that when both of these empires are experiencing a period of peace and prosperity, they actually increase their trade and communication with one another. So this is really important because, again, with this peace and prosperity, we see increased connections between the East and West. So again, like I was saying about the Pax Sinica, it starts during Wudi's rule and it continues for about 200 years afterwards. And what happens during the Pax Sinica is that the country enjoys a period of peace, a growing economy, and an increased population, more agricultural productivity, better development of infrastructure, and with an increased population and more prosperity, people have more money to be interested in buying things like luxury goods. Now this applies also to the Pax Romana. Since people were also gaining wealth in places like Rome, they had the money to buy goods that came from very far away, things that were seen as exotic. So there was a reason why the Pax Sinica and the Pax Romana also mark an increase in the silk trade. So the Silk Road, we should very much be familiar with this. This is an elaborate, very, very long network of roads. We actually see that it's more than one road here. And what it does is it doesn't just connect silk, it connects many luxury goods all the way from the eastern reaches of China to Constantinople, and then it continues farther west into Rome. We just can't see it on this map. Constantinople was sort of like a trading hub. As we discussed in our previous videos on India, there were also branches of the Silk Road that went through India, which is important because there's a clear connection with these empires as well. This is also not only a place where goods are exchanged, ideas traveled along the Silk Road. So Buddhism was introduced from India to China along the Silk Road. And because silk was in such high demand, it increased in production greatly during Wu Di's rule. And silk goods were in high demand throughout Mesopotamia, Persia, Rome, and India, and yielded very high prices. There were significant accomplishments in terms of technology and agricultural methods as well during the Pax Sinica. So this is something that really is easier to accomplish when you're experiencing peace and prosperity. You have the ability to improve technology when you're not worrying about war and civil unrest. And so some of the most important inventions, the by far most important invention during this time was that of paper. Now, we've seen previous ways in which people wrote things down and exchanged their written communication before. We know that in the earliest days of human history, people put down their writing on clay tablets, right, with cuneiform in Sumeria. Now, that was obviously revolutionary for its time, but clay is not particularly transportable, it's heavy, and it's not something that's available everywhere. Then we see when we move on to the Egyptians, they developed papyrus. Now, this is also an important technological innovation, but papyrus, the plant that it comes from, is not something that is available everywhere. So by developing paper through wood pulp, this is something that could be incorporated or adapted into many, many different environments and parts of the world. And also it is lightweight, relatively inexpensive, and so paper is one of the reasons why communication increases dramatically. It helps trade as well. It's a very, very important accomplishment and legacy that came from the Han Dynasty. The Hans also introduced a new calendar, and it contained 365 and a quarter days. That's exactly how many days we really have in our calendar if you account for leap years. So their knowledge of how the actual calendar worked was sophisticated for their day. And then they also improved their agricultural methods. They develop a better plow, and then they also develop a better yoke. And I just wanted to show an image in case you weren't sure what a yoke was. It's this bar that connects two oxen together when they are plowing. And what this new yoke did was it did not put as much pressure on the windpipe of the oxen. And so this allowed them to work longer and more efficiently. And obviously it was also just good for the animal. So China during the Han Dynasty was politically centralized, as we already know. Its capital was located in Chang'an, relatively central, especially if we compare it to the present-day capital of Beijing. Chang'an also shows us how prosperous the Han Dynasty really was. And we don't really have good examples of preserved architecture from the Han Dynasty, so I just wanted to show you an artist rendering of a beautiful palace that existed during the Han Dynasty. But Chang'an, when it was capital of the Han Dynasty, was a beautiful cultural center for the dynasty. It had parks, it had palaces, beautiful gardens, it had walls that protected it from outside invaders. And it was largely, obviously, because it was a capital city, it was a place where many bureaucrats lived, so people who work for the government. So it also was rich in intellectualism. Now, we also see that Chang'an was the eastern end of the Silk Road, so it's going to be a very rich place because so many goods are coming in from faraway places. Now, after the Pax Sinica comes to an end, we do see that the capital is going to move out of Chang'an into Luoyang province. And the reason why that was because there was much more instability in Chang'an and people did not want this unrest to bring down the capital and therefore the dynasty. So moving the capital was a strategic plan to make sure that the dynasty was not overthrown. And arguably it worked at least for a time because the Han Dynasty continues for a few hundred years after the capital moves. So why does the Han Dynasty eventually decline? Now, this is actually not too unlike many of the other declines that take a while, like the Roman Empire. It does not really definitively fall in one day, right? We can say that the Qin Dynasty has a much more dramatic collapse. Now, the Han Dynasty had a number of reasons why it declined. Just like the Roman Empire, and this happens in both places for a reason, because they're connected by trade networks. The Han decline is partially caused by diseases. There were many diseases that spread along the Silk Road. Some of the most deadly were smallpox, measles, and the bubonic plague. And these diseases could kill off up to a quarter of the population, particularly of cities, because people lived in close quarters, and they could easily spread these diseases amongst them. And then when the population declines, we also experience economic problems. As the population declines, it's much harder for people to make a living, the surviving people. Farmers are unable to make as much of a profit when the population declines, so many of them end up in debt, and the only way that they're able to pay their debts oftentimes is to sell off parts of their land to larger landowners. And what this leads to is growing social inequality. There's going to be this much greater gap between the rich and the poor. The rich are really prospering by the suffering of these small farmers, and small farmers are going to become much more resentful of that. We could see this also as a comparison to Rome. Remember the latifundias rather? This is a similar thing. We see that there was a brief period where there was an attempt at land reform. There was a period when the Han Dynasty was challenged, and Wang Ming, who was not from the Han family, ruled the Han Dynasty for a brief period of time. When he ruled, he tried to redistribute land amongst people of different social classes, but there was resentment among the wealthy because they lost out on this deal. And so when Wang Ming was replaced and the Han Dynasty was restored, that attempt at land reform ended. Then we start to see a series of peasant revolts. The largest of these was in 126 CE. It was called the Yellow Turban Rebellion. It was called that because the rebels actually wore scarves that were colored in yellow. And the Yellow Turban Rebellion, it was conducted largely because peasants were very unhappy with the growing social inequality they were seeing, is going to be something that results in millions of casualties. So again, this is going to contribute to the further decline of the population and a further weakening of the economy. And finally, the Han Dynasty is overthrown in 220 BCE. And then after that, China ends up getting divided up into three kingdoms, as we can see here, the Wei, the Wu, and the Shu. We will continue talking about China in period 3, the subsequent dynasties, but this is the end of the Han Dynasty. And what's really important is for you to think about similarities between these different classical empires. There are many, many times when the AP exam likes to compare the Han Dynasty in China to the Roman Empire. So I want us to really think about those similarities, and we're going to spend more time emphasizing those in class. But that's it for the Asian classical empires. We're going to pick up with some in Africa and the Americas to finish up period 2. So thanks so much for watching, and have a good day.